The forward operating bays sat high enough that the air felt thin and cold enough that metal bit bare skin like teeth. Snow had packed itself into every corner, between sandbags, under vehicle wells, along the edges of tent seams. Antennas stood in rows like frozen reeds, coated in frost so thick they looked sculpted. A helicopter lifted off from the pad in a storm of powder, rotors beating the air into a frenzy. Men hunched against the downdraft, hands over helmets, eyes narrowed. The chopper rose and vanished into the low clouds, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Inside the operations tent, heat from a space heater fought a losing battle against the mountain. Breath still fogged in the air. A map board leaned against a crate. A projector threw pale satellite imagery onto a canvas wall. Captain Rourke stood at the front, marker in hand, voice steady in the way commanders learned to make it when they knew something could go wrong. "Escort mission," he said. "We move a signals maintenance team through Kandar Pass to service listening Site 9. It's been throwing interference flags. We restore functionality. We keep eyes and ears on the border corridor. Without that site, we lose early warning." He tapped the map with the marker. "This is your route. Only winter-capable lane for heavy vehicles. If the pass closes, we can't resupply the site. We can't reinforce it. We become blind." Most of the soldiers tracked the marker, saw the ridgelines, the white bands of snowfields, the thin gray line of road. They saw terrain. One person saw something else. Staff Sergeant Mara Kade sat near the edge of the tent, half in shadow. She wasn't tall. She wasn't loud. Her gear was simple and worn in a way that didn't advertise itself. A rifle case leaned against her knee, scuffed and taped at the corners. Her eyes didn't leave the satellite image when it shifted to a closer zoom of the pass. There, on the right wall of the canyon, faint lines that didn't match snow drift patterns. Cable-like shadows. Too straight. Too deliberate. Rourke moved on. Intel reports no major enemy presence in the area. Past harassment has been small arms and sporadic indirect fire, usually at long range. We'll maintain spacing. Keep heads up. Standard contact drills. An intel officer added, "Weather is your main threat today. Whiteout conditions expected within 6 hours. Visibility will drop. That's your biggest risk." Mara raised a hand, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed. "Sir," she said, voice quiet but clear. "The interference flags, are they consistent with weather? Or do we have any indication of deliberate jamming?" The intel officer's expression tightened. "It's mountains. Electronics behave weird and cold. We've seen it before." Mara didn't argue. She let her hand drop, but her gaze stayed on the cable-like shadows. She felt the same old pressure behind her ribs, the one that came when something didn't fit. Outside the tent, the convoy staged up. Engines idled. Soldiers loaded ammo cans and check belts. The signals team carried a hardened case with encryption modules inside. Heavy, locked, and treated like it was made of glass. If it broke, if it got captured, it wasn't just equipment lost. It was voices, plans, lives. Mara moved through the bustle, pulling on a cold weather overlayer that broke up her outline without trying too hard to look like a movie. A younger soldier glanced at her and whispered to another, not realizing she could hear over the wind. "That's her. The one from the mountain op that went bad." The other answered, "No way. Thought they pulled her off the line." Mara didn't react. She'd heard it all before. Sometimes it was said with curiosity, sometimes with accusation. Most times, with that particular tone people used when they were scared and needed someone else to carry the fear. A flash of memory hit her anyway. White slope, sudden roar, body swallowed by moving snow. A teammate's hand disappearing beneath the surface like a drowning man's last wave. Her own finger stiff on the trigger, the moment she hesitated because she couldn't see what she was shooting at, because in mountains you didn't fire unless you were sure. They called it freezing. She called it not making things worse. Sergeant Hensley, platoon marksman, confident and broad-shouldered, stood near a vehicle, adjusting his sling. He watched Mara pass and smirked. "Convoy's got enough rifles," he said. "If anything pops up, I'll handle it up close. Long range is a luxury today." Mara nodded once, as if the comment didn't matter. It did a little, not because it hurt, because it revealed a blind spot. Rourke stepped out of the tent and called the group close. One more thing. We got the option for Overwatch. High Ridge run parallel to the pass. Brutal route. Exposed. No guaranteed extraction if weather turns. No one spoke. They glanced at the ridge line, where the wind tore snow off the peaks in streaming banners. Up there, a man could disappear and never be found until spring. Rourke's eyes moved across faces. I'm not ordering it. It's volunteer only. Still silence. Mara stepped forward. I'll take it, she said. Heads turned. A few brows lifted. Hensley let out a short laugh, like she'd made a joke. Rourke stared at her. Alone. I don't need a team, Mara said. I need a vantage. One radio. One drone. From up top, we'll see anything they've set for you in that pass. The captain hesitated, weighing risk against the thin, instinctual warning in her tone. Weather's turning. I know, she replied. And if you get cut off? Mara's mouth tightened slightly. Then I get cut off. But if they prepared something in that pass, you'll want eyes before you drive into it. Rourke looked at the map again, then at her. He nodded once. You've got 2 hours head start. Check in every 30 minutes. If comms go down, Mara finished. I work the problem. She moved to the armory crate, signed for a lightweight sniper rifle suited for cold conditions, spare magazines, and a compact climbing kit. She clipped an aging thermal optic to her chest harness, functional but temperamental in the cold, the kind of gear that worked until it didn't. Before stepping off, she returned to the tent entrance and stared at the satellite image one last time. She traced the cable-like shadows with a gloved finger, committing angles, distances, and landmarks to memory. The mountain would look different in a storm. A mind map mattered. Then she turned away from warmth and engines and voices and started up a narrow shepherd trail that climbed into emptiness. Behind her, the convoy engines rose in pitch, eager to move. Ahead, the wind swallowed her silhouette in drifting snow. The pass slammed shut. Mara's breath came in measured pulls as the trail steepened. The air was thin enough that her lungs felt like they were working through cloth. The mountain didn't care about rank or reputation. It demanded steady movement and punished hurry. She moved along a parallel ridgeline above the pass, using crampons to bite into slick ice. Her axes tapped in a rhythm. Test plant weight move. Below, and to her left, the road cut through the canyon like a pale scar. The convoy was visible in fragments between gusts, dark shapes, slow and deliberate. At a small outcrop, Mara flattened herself against rock and pulled out her drone, a compact quadcopter barely bigger than her hand. She sent it up into the wind. The drone fought, stabilized, and then held position above the road. The video feed showed the convoy moving normally. Snow drifts looked innocent enough. No figures on the ridges. No muzzle flashes. Then a gust slammed into the drone. The camera fogged with ice crystals. Mara adjusted, nudged it higher for a better angle, and the controller flickered, just for a second, like a heartbeat glitch. She frowned. Not weather. Something else. She pushed the drone forward again, trying to sweep the cliffside. The feed sharpened for a moment, and in that instant she caught it, metallic shapes carved into the cliff, too straight for stone. Dark slots. Gun ports disguised as rock. Her stomach tightened. Before she could speak into the radio, the feed froze. A hard black line cut across the screen. The drone icon blinked, then vanished. Mara stabbed the reconnect button. Nothing. Down below, the convoy entered the narrowest part of the pass, the throat where the ice walls rose so high they seemed to scrape the clouds. The road became a single lane with no room to turn. Mara's view was half obscured by wind, but she could see enough to know they were committed. A split second later, the ambush erupted. Gunfire tore from above, precise, controlled. The lead vehicle jolted as rounds struck the front, forcing it to stop. The rear signals truck shuddered, then sagged as something killed the engine. The column locked in place like a chain snapped at both ends. Mara's radio crackled with shouting. Contact! Contact high right! Rear vehicle down! Get on the gun! She pressed her push to talk. Sato, this is Kade. The answer was a wall of static. Not just weak signal, active interference. Her words dissolved in noise. She switched frequencies. Same. She tried sending a short burst, just a click pattern, anything that might slip through. The static swallowed a hole. A heavy machine gun opened up on the ridge. Mara saw muzzle flash flicker through snow like orange eyes. The weapon swept down the convoy, pinning movement, forcing heads down. Mara dropped prone, pressed her cheek to cold rock, and brought up her optic. For a few seconds, thermal bloom cut through the whiteout. Warm bodies and vehicles, the hot line of an engine, the faint heat of a ridge. Then the optic flickered. Battery. Cold. The image warped at the edges, then collapsed into a dim, unreliable smear. Below, chaos unfolded in flashes between gusts. A driver slumped forward. A signals specialist crawled out of the rear truck, dragging one leg. The encrypted case, hard and dark, skidded toward the cliff edge when a vehicle jerked and a soldier lunged, catching it by the handle of foot from the drop. Mara's eyes snapped to the road ahead. There, an unnatural ridge of snow and rock blocking the lane. Too deliberate. A barricade, or something worse. Engineers would have to clear it, but clearing it meant pushing forward into unknown triggers. The shape of the trap sharpened in her mind. Not just an ambush to kill a patrol. An ambush to isolate that encryption case. To blind the listening sight. To close the pass. A mortar round landed short, throwing up a plume of snow. The next would be closer. Mortars in a canyon weren't just weapons. They were sculptors. They could collapse slopes, seal routes, bury metal and men. Mara tried to shift along the ridge for a clearer line of sight. The terrain fought her, funneling her toward an exposed high point. From there, she might see the gun ports. She might return fire. From there, she would also silhouette herself against the storm, a perfect target if the enemy had their own marksman. She lay still for a heartbeat, feeling the wind hammer her back, hearing distant shouts dissolve into static. Comms jammed, visibility collapsing, mortar fire tightening. The convoy pinned beneath her like insects under glass. Time was shrinking, and somewhere in the white, an enemy commander was counting on the mountain to finish what bullets started. The impossible route. Mara forced herself into calm. Not the absence of fear, she had fear. It was there, tight in her chest, cold in her throat. Calm was simply the decision to work anyway. She studied the ridge line through brief gaps in the storm, comparing it to the satellite image she'd memorized. The mountain's features were distorted now, softened by snow, but geometry remained. There, an angular notch, a diagonal crease, a darker band where ice had been scraped thin by wind. And then she saw it. Beneath a layer of ice in a vertical couloir, an almost straight, faint line running upward, disappearing into rock. Not a natural crack. Too clean. Too consistent. Cable. Her earlier question in the tent came back like a bell. Interference flags, anomalies brushed off as weather. This wasn't weather. This was preparation. Avalanche detonation lines. If the enemy fired charges above the pass, the slope would slide. It wouldn't just bury vehicles, it would close the only winter route. It would strand listening Site 9, isolate it, and give the enemy time to move on it without reinforcement arriving. Mara's, right without headings. Thought for 13ths. The pass had a name on maps, but down here it felt like a throat. A narrow shelf of road clung to the mountain's side, carved into ice and granite by engineers who'd fought the terrain as much as any enemy. On the right, a vertical wall of blue-white ice rose like a frozen wave. On the left, the cliff fell away into a dim ravine where the last light of dusk drowned in snow. The mechanized patrol crawled single file, engines muffled by the storm. Headlights were covered, slitted down to weak amber lines. Tracks and tires chewed at the frozen surface, searching for grip. Every few seconds the wind slammed sideways, flinging snow like handfuls of sand into faces and optics. Inside the lead vehicle, Lieutenant Sato leaned forward, knuckles pale on the radio handset. His driver kept them at a slow, careful pace. Too fast, and you slid. Too slow, and you became a target. The canyon walls pressed close. The sky was a narrow strip of bruised purple above. Snow hissed against armor in a constant whisper, like the mountain was trying to talk them out of being here. And then it spoke louder. The first burst cracked from above, sharp and close, the sound ricocheting down the ice corridor until it became one long, ripping echo. Sparks snapped off armor plating. A round punched through a thin side panel and detonated inside the second vehicle. More smoke than flame, but enough to make the men inside flinch and scramble. Sato's head jerked up. "Contact! Contact high right," he shouted, though the words were swallowed by noise and wind. Another volley tore into the rear of the column. The last vehicle, an armored truck carrying a small signals team, shuddered as something hit the engine block. It lurched, wheels spinning, then died at an angle that half-blocked the road. The patrol was no longer moving. The pass narrowed ahead, barely enough room for a vehicle to squeeze through. Behind them, the wrecked truck closed the throat like a cork. Above them, the ridges were black shapes against the storm, and from those shapes came disciplined, deliberate fire. "Give me air," Sato barked into his radio. "Give me artillery, anything." Static answered him, not the usual hiss of distance or weather. This was thick, aggressive noise, like someone had shoved a speaker full of gravel into his ear. He switched channels, punched the push-to-talk again. Static. He tried the satellite handset. The screen blinked. The signal bar died and returned and died again as the canyon walls swallowed the sky. Outside, a heavier sound rose into a steady, sweeping roar. A machine gun. It wasn't random. It walked rounds across vehicles like a hand brushing crumbs off a table, cutting off movement, forcing heads down. A gunner on the third vehicle popped up to swing his weapon toward the ridge. A burst hit him mid-motion. He vanished backward, landing hard, blood-dark on snow white. Another soldier dove to grab him and got pinned behind a tire as rounds snapped into rubber inches from his face. He tried to crawl and couldn't. The tire was the only cover that existed, and it was already failing. Down the column, Corporal Diaz dragged a wounded teammate into the thin shadow between two vehicles. Diaz's gloves were slick. He tore open a bandage pack with his teeth and pressed it to a pulsing wound near the man's shoulder. "Stay with me," Diaz yelled, though the man's eyes were glassy and unfocused. Diaz's voice cracked. He looked up, eyes wide, and saw the problem that made his stomach drop. Ahead, the pass wasn't clear. Snow and rock had collapsed across the road in a jagged ridge, too high to drive through without pushing. Too compact to be natural. It looked like something had been dumped there on purpose. Behind them, the dead truck sealed the exit. Above them, the machine gun carved the air into pieces. Diaz screamed into the radio anyway. "We're stuck. We can't move forward. We can't move back." Sato didn't need the medic to tell him. He rose just enough to see the geometry of it, the shape of the kill zone. High ground, concealed firing ports, a blocked lane ahead, a disabled vehicle behind. Comms jammed. No clear line of sight to hit back effectively. This wasn't a lucky encounter. This was a trap designed by someone who understood how men moved in mountains. A mortar round landed short with a dull, concussive thump, throwing up a geyser of powdery snow that rained down like ash. The next one would be closer. The one after that would be on target. In this pass, you didn't need to kill everyone with bullets. You could bury them. Sato's mouth went dry. He raised his rifle, aiming toward a ridge he could barely see, and knew it was useless. He could shoot into the storm for hours and never hit a thing. A new burst of machine gun fire began to swing toward the vehicle where Diaz worked. The sound grew louder, closer, like a saw cutting toward bone. And then the world went strange. Not quiet exactly. The storm still screamed. Snow still hissed against steel. But the gunfire seemed to recede, like someone had taken the chaos and pushed it behind a wall of glass. A different sound took over. A slow inhale, a controlled exhale. Somewhere above, hidden in the white, a face rested behind scope. Crosshairs held steady on a tiny glint of metal high on the enemy ridge, just a fraction of light where an exposed barrel or feed tray caught the dying sun. The shot was a clean crack, sharp enough to cut the wind. The glint vanished. The heavy machine gun stuttered once, twice, then fell silent as if a hand had simply turned it off. For a heartbeat, the volume of incoming fire collapsed. The ambushers hesitated. Confusion rippled through the ridge line. Men shouted to each other, their voices faint and distorted by distance and wind. Down in the kill box, a soldier pinned behind the tire lifted his head, stunned, eyes searching the ridge. Who the hell was that? He rasped in a broken comms, half expecting an answer. None came, only the storm and the echo of a rifle report fading into snow, and the sense, sharp as a knife, that the patrol had just been saved by someone they hadn't even known was there. Someone the unit barely trusted. Someone they almost left behind. The wind rose again, swallowing everything. 8 hours earlier, the forward operating base sat high enough that the air felt thin and cold enough that metal bit bare skin like teeth. Snow packed itself into every corner, between sandbags, under vehicle wells, along the edges of tent seams. Antennas stood in rows like frozen reeds, coated in frost so thick they looked sculpted. A helicopter lifted off from the pad in a storm of powder, rotors beating the air into a frenzy. Men hunched against the downdraft, hands over helmets, eyes narrowed. The chopper rose and vanished into the low clouds, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Inside the operations tent, heat from a space heater fought a losing battle against the mountain. Breath still fogged in the air. A map board leaned against a crate. A projector threw pale satellite imagery onto a canvas wall. Captain Rourke stood at the front, marker in hand, voice steady in the way commanders learned to make it when they knew something could go wrong. Escort mission, he said. We move a signals maintenance team through Kandar Pass to service listening Site 9. It's been throwing interference flags. We restore functionality. We keep eyes and ears on the border corridor. Without that site, we lose early warning. He tapped the map with the marker. This is your route. Only winter-capable lane for heavy vehicles. If the pass closes, we can't resupply the site. We can't reinforce it. We become blind. Most of the soldiers tracked the marker, saw ridgelines, snowfields, a thin gray line of road. They saw terrain. One person saw something else. Staff Sergeant Mara Kade sat near the edge of the tent, half in shadow. She wasn't tall. She wasn't loud. Her gear was simple and worn in a way that didn't advertise itself. A rifle case leaned against her knee, scuffed and taped at the corners. Her eyes didn't leave the satellite image when it shifted to a closer zoom of the pass. There, on the right wall of the canyon, faint lines that didn't match snow drift patterns. Cable-like shadows. Too straight. Too deliberate. Rourke moved on. Intel reports no major enemy presence in the area. Past harassment has been small arms and sporadic indirect fire, usually at long range. We'll maintain spacing, keep heads up, standard contact drills. An Intel officer added, weather is your main threat today. Whiteout conditions expected within 6 hours. Visibility will drop. That's your biggest risk. Mara raised a hand. Not dramatic, just enough to be noticed. Sir, she said, voice quiet but clear. The interference flags, are they consistent with weather? Or do we have any indication of deliberate jamming? The Intel officer's expression tightened. It's mountains. Electronics behave weird and cold. We've seen it before. Mara didn't argue. She let her hand drop, but her gaze stayed on those cable-like shadows. She felt the old pressure behind her ribs, the one that came when something didn't fit and nobody wanted to hear it. Outside the tent, the convoy staged up. Engines idled. Soldiers loaded ammo cans and check belts. The signals team carried a hardened case with encryption modules inside. Heavy, locked, and treated like it was made of glass. If it broke, if it got captured, it wasn't just equipment lost. It was voices, plans, lives. Mara moved through the bustle, pulling on a cold weather overlayer that broke up her outline without trying too hard to look like a poster. A younger soldier glanced at her and whispered to another, not realizing she could hear over the wind. That's her. The one from the mountain op that went bad. The other answered, no way. Thought they pulled her off the line. Mara didn't react. She'd heard it all before. Sometimes it was said with curiosity. Sometimes with accusation. Most times with that particular tone people used when they were scared and needed someone else to carry the fear. A flash of memory hit her anyway. White slope, sudden roar, bodies swallowed by moving snow. A teammate's hand disappearing beneath the surface like a drowning man's last wave. Her own finger stiff on the trigger, the moment she hesitated because she couldn't see what she was shooting at, because in mountains you didn't fire unless you were sure. They called it freezing. She called it not making things worse. Sergeant Hensley, platoon marksman, confident and broad-shouldered, stood near a vehicle, adjusting his sling. He watched Mara pass and smirked. "Convoy's got enough rifles," he said. "If anything pops up, I'll handle it up close." Long range is a luxury today. Mara nodded once, as if the comment didn't matter. It did a little, not because it hurt, but because it revealed a blind spot. Mountains punished blind spots. Rourke stepped out of the tent and called the group close. "One more thing. We got the option for overwatch. High ridge, run parallel to the pass. Brutal route. Exposed. No guaranteed extraction if weather turns." No one spoke. They glanced at the ridge line, where the wind tore snow off peaks in streaming banners. Up there, a person could disappear and not be found until spring, if then. Rourke's eyes moved across faces. "I'm not ordering it. It's volunteer only." Still silence. Mara stepped forward. "I'll take it," she said. Heads turned. A few brows lifted. Hensley let out a short laugh, like she'd made a joke. Rourke stared at her. "Alone. I don't need a team," Mara said. "I need a vantage. One radio. One drone. From up top, we'll see anything they've set for you in that pass." The captain hesitated, weighing risk against the thin, instinctual warning in her tone. "Weather's turning. I know. And if you get cut off?" Mara's mouth tightened slightly. "Then I get cut off. But if they've prepared something in that pass, you'll want eyes before you drive into it." Rourke looked at the map again, then at her. He nodded once. "You got a head start. Check in every 30 minutes. If comms go down, Mara finished. "I work the problem." She moved to the armory crate, signed for a lightweight precision rifle suited for cold conditions, spare magazines, and a compact climbing kit. She clipped an aging thermal optic to her chest harness, functional but temperamental in the cold, the kind of gear that worked until it didn't. Before stepping off, she returned to the tent entrance and stared at the satellite image one last time. She traced those cable-like shadows with a gloved finger, committing angles, distances, and landmarks to memory. The mountain would look different in a storm. Memory mattered. Then she turned away from warmth and engines and voices and started up a narrow shepherd trail that climbed into emptiness. Behind her, the convoy engines rose in pitch, eager to move. Ahead, the wind swallowed her silhouette in drifting snow. The climb wasn't dramatic at first, just long. The kind of incline that pretended to be gentle until your legs burned and your lungs felt like they were working through cloth. Mara moved with the slow certainty of someone who had learned, the hard way, that rushing killed you faster than bullets in these mountains. She kept the convoy in the corner of her awareness, a dark thread below. Every so often she checked in on the radio, short and precise, and for the first hour, she got answers. Sato's voice was clipped and calm, the way officers talked when they were trying to keep calm contagious. Then the wind thickened, the sky lowered, and the ridgeline became a curtain of white. Mara reached an outcrop and deployed her drone. It fought for stability, hovering above the road. The feed showed the convoy's slow progress, snow drifts, ice walls. Nothing obvious. That made her more uneasy, not less. She pushed the drone toward the cliff face with those straight shadows, trying to confirm what her instinct insisted was there. The controller flickered, once like a heartbeat stutter. The image jittered. Mara's stomach tightened. Not weather. And then she saw it, just a flicker before the feed froze. Dark slots. Metallic edges disguised as stone. Gun ports. The screen went black. At the same moment, the valley below erupted. Her radio came alive with broken shouts, and then drowned in static. She tried to punch through, call signs, coordinates, anything. Nothing. An enemy jammer was flooding the frequency. The canyon walls did the rest, trapping the signal like smoke in a bottle. Mara dropped prone on wind-scoured rock and brought up her optic. Thermal bloom cut through the white for a few seconds. Warm engines, warm bodies, faint hot points were weapons fired from above. Then the optic flickered. Battery warning. Cold had eaten the charge faster than it should. The image warped at the edges and collapsed into a dim smear. Below, she could see enough through gaps in the storm to understand the shape of the trap. A disabled rear vehicle. A blocked road ahead. High ground fire from concealed positions. Mortar impacts, testing range. The pass wasn't a road anymore. It was a funnel. Her mind began counting constraints like a metronome. Comms down. Visibility collapsing. Wounded accumulating. Enemy on high ground. Time pressure as mortars adjusted. Equipment failing. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the encryption case. Heavy, valuable. The reason this convoy mattered was being protected by men who couldn't even see who was shooting them. Mara shifted along the ridge, searching for a better angle. The mountain pushed her toward exposure. Every position that offered sight also offered her silhouette. She paused, pressed her forehead against cold rock, and forced her breathing into a rhythm. Inhale for 4. Hold. Exhale for 4. The storm couldn't steal that from her. If she lost her breath, she lost everything. Through a gap, she spotted that straight line again. Beneath ice in a vertical couloir, faint but undeniable. Cable under frozen glaze, running upward like a vein. Her earlier question in the tent came back like a bell. Interference flags, anomalies, brushed off as weather. This wasn't weather. Avalanche detonation lines. The enemy didn't just want to kill the patrol. They wanted to close the pass, permanently, at least for the season. Close the only winter route to listening Sight 9. Isolate it. Blind it. Then take what they wanted from it in the quiet afterward. The revelation didn't bring relief. It brought urgency sharp enough to taste. Because if those charges went off with the convoy in the wrong place, there would be no rescue. Just a buried line of metal under a white slope and an empty road the next day. Mara looked up the couloir. It was steep, ice-polished, exposed. In good weather, it was a hard climb. In this storm, it was a question with teeth. It also offered something the ridge didn't. A hidden line. A route nobody would choose unless they had to. Her hands tightened on her axis. Another mortar round landed, closer this time, and the plume of snow rose like a warning. Mara started toward the couloir. The first meters were all friction and faith. Crampons bit. Axes found purchase in thin cracks. Wind shoved at her like a physical thing. Snow hissed in her collar, melted with body heat, then froze again. She moved with the methodical precision of someone counting each motion to keep panic from finding a gap. Halfway up, her mind tried to betray her. A memory surged without permission. Another couloir, years ago. A team climbing in daylight. The subtle sound, whomp, that came before the slope released. A white wall moving faster than running. Teammates swept away, screaming swallowed by snow. Her own voice hoarse from yelling to pull back. Her own fingers locked around a trigger she never pulled because she couldn't see the threat clearly enough to justify a shot. Afterward, they said she'd hesitated. Afterward, she had stopped correcting them. Because what was the point? The dead didn't care who was blamed. Mara's grip tightened until her gloves creaked. She forced the memory down into the place. She kept it when she needed to function. Not gone, just contained. Anchor. Plant. Wait. Move, she whispered to herself. Not because she needed the words, but because the sound of her own voice cut through the storm in a way that gave her something solid. She climbed. The couloir narrowed. Ice grew slicker. A gust hit hard enough to make her body sway. She pressed herself flat against the wall, feeling the cold seep through layers. A chunk of ice broke loose under her right crampon. For a heartbeat, gravity took her. Her body dropped. The rifle on her back swung out, pulling her off balance. One axe held, just barely, its pick buried in a seam. The rope she'd run between anchors snapped tight and bit into her harness. She hung there, boots scrabbling, wind screaming in her ears. Fear surged hot and immediate. And then function reclaimed her. She slowed her breathing, found a new foothold, shifted weight with care that felt impossible, climbed back up onto the ice like she was climbing out of her own past. When she hauled herself onto a small stance, she felt the thermal optic slam against rock. The sound was dull, but the impact made her wince. She unclipped it and saw a crack spidered across the outer lens. It still powered on. It still showed thermal bloom, but the edges were distorted now, like looking through broken glass. Her field of view had narrowed. Every shot would be harder. She kept climbing anyway. Near the midpoint of the couloir, she found what she'd been searching for without knowing it existed. A narrow ledge, hidden from above and below by the angle of the rock. It was barely wide enough for her hips. A slit in the mountain. From here, she had a sliver of sight line into the cliff face opposite the pass, into a recess carved into stone, half covered by snow drifts. A command pocket. Mara lay prone, pressed her cheek to ice, and lifted the cracked optic. Shapes resolved in the thermal view, clustered bodies around a map board, heads close together. A tripod-mounted antenna with a hot base, jammer. A box with cables running upward, detonation control, likely tied to those avalanche lines. And below them, moving along a higher path that cut toward listening Site 9, a separate cluster of fighters staging gear. They weren't looking down at the convoy. They were looking beyond it, toward the listening site. This wasn't a random ambush. It was an operation. Mara raised her radio and tried again. The jammer still flooded the net, but from this angle and proximity, she might be able to push a fragment through. She keyed the mic and spoke in short bursts, letting silence between phrases give any chance of slipping past noise. "Charges above you," she said. "They want the site. Don't push forward." Static swallowed most of it, but she heard a faint echo, like her own voice bouncing off a far wall. Below, Sato's convoy didn't surge forward into the snow barricade. That mattered. That bought time. Even if he didn't fully understand why, he sensed the warning. Mara didn't have time to hope for more. She dug a shallow platform into the ice with her glove and the back of her axe, just enough to settle her rifle without it sliding. She laid out spare magazines within reach and checked her count. Enough, but not for waste. The storm had already eaten her patience. Now it'd eat her ammo, one shot at a time. Her cracked optic narrowed the world. Her breath became the metronome. The wind became the unpredictable variable. She waited for a lull, a fraction of a second when gusts eased and her crosshairs didn't dance. Her mind built a ladder of priorities, the way she'd been trained and the way she'd refined through hard experience. Remove force multipliers first. Anything that amplified the enemy's ability to kill or control. Anything that blinded or pinned friendly forces. Anything that coordinated. Jammer first. Then heavy weapons. Then whoever was directing mortars and movement. Then, if she lived long enough, the detonator. Mara found the jammer operator in the thermal view, hunched near the antenna, hands adjusting dials. She couldn't see his face. She didn't need to. His role mattered more than his identity. She timed her shot between gusts, exhaled slowly, and pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked. Recoil pushed into her shoulder, familiar and grounding. In the optic, the jammer operator snapped backward and collapsed. The antenna sagged, tilting like a plant cut at the stem. A heartbeat later, her radio hissed, and then, like a voice breaking through water, Sato's call sign came through, distorted but present. "Kade? Kade, say again." Mara didn't answer immediately. She listened for enemy reaction. In the recess, the cluster of leaders jolted into motion. Arms waved. Heads turned. Someone shouted, pointing toward the ridge. They knew something had changed. The incoming fire from the past didn't stop, but it lost cohesion. The machine gun that had been walking rounds shifted, paused, shifted again, uncertain now, like the gunner had lost his rhythm. Mara slid her crosshairs to the machine gun team. The weapon was tucked into a rock slot with a narrow firing lane. She couldn't see the whole crew, but she caught a hot shoulder and the bright line of the barrel. She fired. The gunner slumped. The weapon dipped. The assistant reached for it, trying to reseat the feed. Mara fired again. The assistant collapsed over the gun like a blanket. Down in the kill box, that mattered instantly. The volume of fire pinning the convoy dropped. Diaz, the medic, used the gap to drag the wounded man deeper into cover. A fire team shifted behind a vehicle without being shredded for it. A gunner on the convoy side swung his weapon toward a ridge and finally dared to return fire. Sato's voice came through clearer now, the jam broken, but the canyon still doing its best to muffle signals. "Kade, where are you?" "Hi," Mara answered. "Stay put. Don't push the barricade. Charges above you." A pause. "Charges. Avalanche lines," she said. "They'll bury the pass." Sato swore softly. "Understood. We're pinned." "I know," Mara said. "I'm working." She went back to the ladder. An RPG team moved along a higher ledge toward the convoy's lead vehicle, seeking an angle to hit armor at weaker points. Mara caught their heat signatures as they stopped to shoulder the tube. She didn't shoot the man holding the launcher first. She shot the man behind him, the one holding a bundle, the one likely carrying extra rounds, the one who could sustain the threat. The second shot took the launcher carrier as he tried to swing toward her. The team scattered, hugging rock the opportunity spoiled. In the recess, enemy leaders adapted fast. They weren't amateurs. They shifted positions deeper into cover. One of them pulled out a radio and shouted orders to unseen units. A designated enemy sniper, someone with patience and training, began scanning for the source of the precise shots. A spotter deployed a small quadcopter drone, sending it into the storm's edge to hunt for glint, muzzle blast movement. Mara felt the change before she saw it. The air around her seemed to tighten, as if the mountain itself had become suspicious. She moved her rifle slightly, adjusting her position on the ledge. The ice was cold enough to numb her elbows through sleeves. Wind shoved at her cheek. She fired again, this time at a figure she identified as a squad leader by posture and movement. The man pointing, the man others watched. The shot hit. The leader crumpled. The effect was immediate. A few enemy fighters hesitated, as if their internal map had lost a landmark. But the enemy didn't break. They adapted. The drone's faint buzz reached Mara, almost lost in the wind, but there. It drifted above the couloir, a dark speck against white. In the optic's distorted edges, it flickered like an insect. Mara shifted slightly to reduce her silhouette. She couldn't shoot the drone without revealing more of her position, and she didn't have ammo to waste. She waited. A heartbeat later, a round cracked into the ice inches from her face, showering her with shards. The enemy sniper had found a hint of her ledge, maybe from the drone, maybe from the faint flash of her muzzle hidden too late. Mara flattened, heart punching hard. Another shot snapped past, the sound of it slicing the wind more terrifying than the impact. She forced herself to breathe slower than her body wanted. Panic was noise. Noise got you killed. She crawled sideways along the ledge, inch by inch, shifting to a slightly different angle. Her rope tugged, reminding her she was anchored, that she was not falling today. She settled behind her pack, using it as shallow cover, and waited for the next enemy shot. It came, close again, striking where her head had been. Good. The enemy sniper was committing to the old position. Mara took advantage of that predictability. She raised the cracked optic just enough to reacquire the command recess. In the thermal view, she spotted a figure holding a handset, gesturing toward the sky and then toward the pass, likely the forward observer coordinating mortars. Mortars with a clock. Mortars could end this without a single infantryman ever stepping into the open. She put the crosshairs on the observer's chest and fired. The figure jerked and dropped. The handset fell, still glowing with heat. Mara fired a follow-up shot, not a body this time, but at the radio itself, shattering it. If the observer's backup tried to use it, they couldn't. Down below, the mortar impacts became erratic. One landed too far, another too close, as if someone was guessing instead of calculating. That bought the convoy breaths they'd been losing. Mara's ammo count ticked down. She checked her magazines by feel. Fewer now. The storm didn't care. The enemy didn't care. The ladder had to tighten. Every shot had a matter. Sato's voice came again, strained. We're taking casualties. We can't move. You can, Mara said, when I open a lane. Ow! Mara's eyes flicked up along the avalanche lines. The cables disappeared into a cluster of rock above, where charges were likely set to release a controlled slide. The enemy had planned to fire them when the convoy pushed into the worst possible place, when the vehicles were nose to tail and the pass was most constricted. Mara could reverse that. If she triggered the charges while the convoy was tucked under a rock spur, a safe shadow, where the slope angle was different, they might avoid the worst of the slide. The avalanche could sweep enemy positions and also break the artificial barricade ahead by force. It was improvisation on a razor's edge. It was also the only move that changed the geometry completely. "Listen carefully," Mara said into the radio, voice calm because it had to be. "See the rock spur on your left about 30 meters ahead? The one that juts like a tooth." A pause. "I see it. Get your vehicles and personnel into its shadow. Hug that wall. Low profile. Stay there until I tell you." "What are you doing?" Mara swallowed. The memory of the earlier avalanche flickered like lightning behind her eyes. The sound of snow moving. The helplessness. "I'm going to make the mountain move," she said. Sato didn't argue. He was an officer who understood that sometimes your choices were all bad and you chose the one that killed fewer people. "Copy," he said. "Moving is able." Below, soldiers began shifting, dragging wounded, covering each other, pushing into the narrow shadow under the rock spur. It wasn't perfect. They were still under fire. But the enemy's cohesion was fractured now, their heavy weapons reduced, their mortar coordination disrupted. In the command recess, enemy leaders realized what was happening. One of them pointed up toward the avalanche lines and then toward the convoy. A man grabbed the detonator box. They were going to fire at themselves right now, before Mara could. The drone buzz returned, closer, hovering near the couloir. The enemy sniper fired again, chiseling ice near Mara's pack. This time the shots came faster, trying to bracket her. And then there was a new threat: climbers. Heat signatures appeared lower on the couloir, moving upward with careful intent. The enemy had sent a small team to ascend toward Mara's position, to kill her the old way, quietly, with knives and short-range fire in the ice corridor where long range didn't matter. Mara's ladder had a new rung, and she didn't have the ammo to satisfy every problem. If she focused on the climbers, the enemy might detonate the avalanche and bury the convoy. If she focused on the detonation junction, the climbers might reach her and end her before the shot. Fear rose, hot and insistent. Function answered it with one brutal question: what saves the most lives? The convoy below was everything. If she died after opening the lane, it would still be worth it. If she lived but failed to stop the avalanche at the wrong time, the convoy would become a grave. Mara chose the higher purpose. She shifted her rifle upward, ignoring the ache in her arms, ignoring the sting of ice shards in her cheek. The cracked optic narrowed her world to a small, distorted window. She found a junction point where the cables met a main charge cluster, a brittle casing half buried under ice, the kind of setup made to be triggered electrically but still vulnerable to physical shock if struck right. The enemy's sniper fired again. A round hit her pack, punching through fabric, scattering insulation. She felt the impact like a shove. She didn't flinch. Below, Sato's voice came once more, tight with urgency. "We're in the shadow. Wounded are as covered as we can get." Mara exhaled slowly. The storm, the gunfire, the screams, she pushed them away until there was only her breath and the thin crosshair line. For a moment, silence lived inside her head. And in that silence, the past avalanche rose again, not as a wound, but as a lesson. When you know the slope is unstable and you don't act, the mountain acts anyway. This time, she would act. She pressed the trigger. The rifle report cracked through the whiteout like a whip. In the optic, the round struck the casing. Sparks spat, bright against snow. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then a line of light rippled along the slope, small flashes in sequence, charges igniting in a chain. The sound followed, a series of deep thumps muffled by snow, like the mountain's heartbeat going off rhythm. The upper slope released. At first it was just a subtle shift, a settling. Then the avalanche roared. It wasn't the wide, uncontrolled wall from Mara's memory. This was directional, guided by charges and terrain. A moving river of snow and ice that poured down the face with terrifying speed. It slammed into enemy firing positions on the upper ledges, swallowing rock slots and gun ports, ripping bodies and weapons free like toys. Climbers in the couloir shouted, their heat signatures jolting in panic as the world above them turned into motion. Some tried to cling to the wall. Others vanished as the slide's edge licked the corridor. The enemy sniper fired once more, wild now, and then his position disappeared in the white surge. Down below, the convoy hunkered beneath the rock spur as the avalanche thundered past. Snow blasted into the pass, a hurricane of powder and debris. Vehicles rocked. Soldiers pressed faces into sleeves. Diaz curled over a wounded man, body shielding body. This safe shadow held, not untouched, but survivable. And the artificial barricade ahead, the ridge of snow and rock placed to trap the convoy, shattered under the avalanche's force. It broke apart and slid, spilling down the cliff edge and out of the road's centerline. The pass that had been sealed became, suddenly, a rough lane of jagged ice and churned snow. It wasn't pretty. It was open. When the roar finally diminished into the storm's constant scream, the enemy's fire was different. Scattered, panicked, leaderless. A few surviving fighters fired sporadically from lower positions, but the coordinated kill zone was gone. The command recess was buried and broken. The heavy weapons that had pinned the convoy were silent. Sato lifted his head, eyes wide, snow caked on his helmet. He stared at the newly opened lane ahead like it was a mirage. "Move," he rasped. "Move now." The convoy surged as much as vehicles could surge on ice. Drivers coaxed engines, tires and tracks gripping and slipping. Soldiers ran alongside, guiding wheels through jagged ruts. Engineers with metal detectors and probes moved fast, checking for secondary charges, aware that a competent enemy would seed the escape route. Friendly gunners fired into remaining enemy positions, forcing heads down. A small element pushed forward to secure the approach toward listening Site 9, knowing the enemy had staged a separate team to move on it. In the chaos of movement, Sato keyed his radio again. "Kade, where are you?" "Status." Mara didn't answer immediately. Her arms trembled from cold and strain. Her face was numb. Her pack was punctured. Her optic lens was cracked. The ledge beneath her was dusted with fresh snow from the avalanche blast. And the climbers. She shifted her cracked optic down the couloir. 2 heat signatures remained, lower now, clinging to rock alive. One moved, lifting a weapon. Mara had maybe seconds before they fired up toward her, before they turned the couloir into her grave. Her ammo was low, but not empty. She fired once. One signature disappeared. The other tried to scramble behind a rock bulge. Mara fired again. Silence, at least in that small part of the world. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fear didn't vanish. It simply loosened, making room for the next task. She keyed her radio. "I'm up high. You got a lane. Take it. Don't stop." Sato's voice came back rough with disbelief and something like respect. "Copy. We're moving. Get out when you can." Mara looked up at the ridge where the avalanche had carved a scar into the mountain, exposing dark stone beneath the snow. The slope looked calmer now, as if nothing had happened, as if the mountain hadn't just decided the outcome of a battle. She began her down climb, slow and careful. No hero moves, no rushing. The mountain punished bravado. Below, the convoy crawled through the open pass. Vehicles scraped jagged ice, metal groaning. Soldiers stared up at the scarred slope where enemy positions had been moments ago, the reality of how close they'd come to being buried settling like a weight. Diaz worked on the wounded, hands shaking, voice steady through grit. The squad leader who had nearly bled out behind the tire was stabilized enough to move. When the convoy reached a wider stretch of road down the valley where a helicopter could land, medics loaded the wounded aboard. The rotors beat the air. The aircraft rose into the storm, carrying life away from death. By the time Mara reached the lower ridge, her fingers were numb enough that she struggled with buckles. She kept moving anyway, guided by muscle memory and stubbornness. At the shattered cliff recess that had served as the enemy command pocket, A clearing team dug through snow and debris. They recovered maps stuck to a board, a battered laptop case, and a rugged tablet half buried but intact. The encryption case from the convoy, still secure, was carried forward under heavy guard, protected like the beating heart of the mission. Listening Site 9 came into view eventually. A small cluster of structures tucked into a mountainside, antennas raised toward a sky that rarely offered kindness. The friendly element that had surged ahead reached it in time to deter the enemy's follow-on team. A brief firefight in the upper approach ended with enemy fighters retreating into the storm, denied their prize. Night fell hard. The mountains swallowed light completely. The storm eased only enough to make the cold more noticeable. Back at base, the debrief room smelled like damp gear and burnt coffee. Maps were spread across a table. Screens showed still images pulled from recovered devices. The men who had been in the kill zone sat with shoulders hunched, faces hollowed by adrenaline and exhaustion. Captain Rourke stood near the front, eyes moving from soldier to soldier. He looked different than he had in the morning, less composed, more human, as if he'd aged a year in a day. Mara sat near the edge of the room again, half in shadow. Her hands were wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. Her cracked optic sat on the table in front of her like a witness. An intel analyst spoke first, pointing at the recovered tablet's contents. This wasn't opportunistic, he said. They had imagery of the convoy staging area. They had timing windows. They had the jammer and the avalanche charges in place days ago. A series of photos appeared, cables along the cliff face, charges tucked into rock, diagrams of the pass. The cable-like shadows Mara had traced were now obvious, no longer deniable as weather. They planned to close the pass, the analyst continued. Make it impassable. That cuts resupply to listening Site 9. It also forces our traffic to reroute through lower valleys where they can hit us again. Another slide showed a graphic of listening Site 9's equipment, labeled in a language the soldiers didn't read fluently, but understood by context. Encryption modules, frequency hopping, network keys. They wanted the site's encryption hardware, the analyst said. Not just to deny us comms, but to exploit them. Capture modules, study them, produce propaganda by impersonating traffic or intercepting transmissions. Potentially use it to time attacks. This was a rehearsal for a larger effort to blind and fracture regional defenses. The room went quiet. The soldiers felt, in a visceral way, the difference between surviving an ambush and preventing something worse. Rourke looked at Mara. Walk us through it, he said. All eyes shifted to her. Mara's throat tightened, not from fear of talking, but from the weight of what those eyes contained. Doubt turned into something else. She didn't want praise. She didn't want a myth. She wanted the truth to be useful. She set her cup down. I saw anomalies on the satellite image, she said. Straight lines. Cables under ice. It didn't match natural drift. The intel officer from earlier shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Mara didn't glare. She continued. Interference reports didn't feel like weather. When I launched my drone, I got a controller glitch before the feed died. Then I saw gun ports in a cliff. By the time I tried to warn you, the net was jammed. Sato nodded slowly. We heard fragments, enough to know not to push forward. Mara continued, voice steady. I climbed the couloir to get line of sight into their command pocket. I found the jammer and the detonator. I prioritized the jammer first to restore comms, then heavy weapons, then the forward observer coordinating mortars. When I realized they were about to detonate the slope with you in the funnel, I triggered the charges at the junction point and had you move into the rock spur shadow. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't soften it. It was a risk, she said. But the alternative was letting them choose when and where the mountain moved. That would have buried you. Rourke stared at the cracked optic. You triggered an avalanche on purpose, he said, as if tasting the words. Yes, sir. And you did it alone. Mara nodded once. Nobody else was in position. Nobody else could get there in time. There was a long pause. In that pause, the quiet judgments that had followed Mara through the unit tried to rearrange themselves into something more honest. Hensley, the marksman who dismissed her that morning, cleared his throat. He looked at the table, not at her. When a machine gun went silent, he said, voice low. I thought it was luck. Or air. But comms were dead, and it felt like someone reached into the fight and pulled a plug. Mara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Rourke finally spoke, tone formal, because commanders sometimes used formality to avoid sounding too emotional in front of their people. Your actions prevented catastrophic loss of life and strategic terrain, he said. We'll write it up properly. Mara's eyes stayed on her hands. Praise didn't warm you. It didn't erase the cold in your bones. It didn't bring back what the mountain had taken years ago. Sato leaned forward slightly. Staff Sergeant, he said, quieter than the room. Those cable lines, you saw them before any of us. Why didn't you push harder in the brief? Mara's jaw tightened. The answer lived in a place she didn't like to visit. Because last time she'd pushed harder, she'd been overruled anyway. Because last time she'd been right, and it hadn't saved anyone. Because after the avalanche years ago, she'd learned that certainty didn't always matter if nobody listened. She swallowed. I asked, she said. That's what I could do in the tent. Up there, I could do more. Rourke studied her face. That other operation, he said carefully. The one people whisper about. The room went even quieter. This was the open wound nobody wanted to poke. Mara's fingers tightened around her cup until it creaked. For a moment, she considered staying silent. Let the old story remain the old story. But silence had a cost. She'd learned that too. It was a slope stability call, she said. We were climbing a similar couloir. I noticed the snowpack shifting, subtle, but it was there. I recommended we pull back. Leadership decided we were on a timeline and kept going. When the slope released, it took my team. Diaz, the medic, stared at her, expression raw. Mara continued, voice control with effort. Afterward, people said I froze. They saw me not firing. They didn't understand there was nothing to shoot. The mountain doesn't care about bullets. Hensley looked up then, finally meeting her eyes, shame flickering across his face like a shadow passing. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room understood more than it had that morning. Rourke's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. And today, Mara looked at the cracked optic. She thought of the moment she chose to trigger the avalanche, the moment fear rose and function answered. Today, she said, I didn't let the mountain decide for us. The debrief moved on, logistics, next steps, how to reinforce listening Site 9, how to hunt whoever had planned the ambush. Names and units were discussed, broader campaign implications mapped out. The enemy had been competent, intentional, backed by someone with equipment and planning capacity, someone who understood that a propaganda victory didn't require a camera if you could steal voices and make chaos in the dark. But Mara's attention drifted to small details instead. The way soldiers who had once whispered about her now glanced at her with something like gratitude. The way Sato's posture eased when he realized the ghost on the ridge had been real. Later, when the room emptied and the base quieted into night, Mara stepped outside. The storm had lessened. Wind still moved snow across the ground in thin sheets, but the sky had opened enough to show stars, sharp, cold, indifferent. The mountains stood black against them, jagged as teeth. Mara walked to the edge of the base plateau, where you could see, in the distance, the faint line of the pass. A new resupply convoy moved far below, tiny lights crawling through the reopened lane like ants carrying something precious. She adjusted the cracked optic on her rifle, not fixing it, just settling it, as if accepting its scar the way she accepted her own. The mountain wind touched her face, cold and clean. Somewhere below, men would remember the ambush as a blur of noise and fear and sudden silence. They would remember the past that almost closed forever. They would tell the story of how one shot changed the fight, how the impossible happened in a whiteout. Mara didn't need the story. She remembered the climb, the ice breaking under her foot, the rope biting into her harness, the moment she chose function over fear. She remembered the decision to make the mountain move instead of waiting for it to move first. And as the distant convoy lights disappeared into the canyon, she held onto one quiet truth that didn't need applause to be real. Sometimes the difference between a dead unit and a living one is the person who chooses the worst ground. Eyes open, afraid, and moving anyway.